All right, so there's a number of people coming in, and we're at the 11:30 mark. So I wanted to get started, and so one of the things I was wanted you to do, Craig, was for those that are not familiar with you or your work, to introduce yourself and that work, and then we would kind of go off of that and talk a little bit about this book that you've published, and maybe even give us a little bit of a preview of what might be coming down the road here. But
Definitely.
yeah, but we'll
Definitely.
start with the introduction.
Sure. Daniel, thank you so much for the invitation, for everyone here. It's a pleasure to meet you. Happy Sunday. God bless you all, and peace be with you. So, yeah, my journey has been pretty unconventional. I'll give you a little personal backdrop. I'm from Needham, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston. And I was 15 when 9/11 happened, and I didn't expect that day to have such a big impact on my life, but it did. And in The Humanity of Muhammad, the book that was on the flyer, I talk about what happened that day. Obviously, everyone knows what happened, but for me, living in the town that I lived in, a relatively homogenous town, predominantly, overwhelmingly Christian, Protestant and Catholic, and then also overwhelmingly white. We had no Muslims in our high school. I went to a public high school. In Catholic school, I also went to Catholic school. No one was informing us about Muslims or Islam. So really, there was no context to make sense of not necessarily no context to make sense of 9/11. There was no context or information for people like me to make sense of what was being thrown at us in the media. Because the media, as you know, very powerful tool. And it was just, demonizing really in overt ways sometimes the faith of so many people around the world. The invasion of Afghanistan happens quickly after 9/11. The invasion of Iraq happens in 2003. So I'm 18 years old. I'm in college to actually play basketball, which I didn't talk about in the book. But when it came time to pick a major, I decided I wanted to focus on international relations to figure out, why did something like 9/11 actually happen? And I was entering my studies with a slightly Islamophobic worldview, if you know what I mean. Like I was like, these people don't like us. These people have a faith which is incompatible to my faith. And long story short, I ended up transferring to American University in Washington, D.C., and I was taking Arabic courses and all of these poli-sci courses on Islam and international relations, really in order to enter either the intelligence realm, so FBI, CIA, or the State Department. Like I wanted to get involved in that area. And I was really blessed, I thank God, often that I walked into the classroom of Professor Akbar Ahmed, who is an anthropologist in the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University, even to this day. And the first class, The World of Islam, that I walked into was, I'm pretty sure consciously I can say that he was the first Muslim I had ever met in my life. And he was the first person to ever speak about Islam in front of me that was not in the media. And he just begins this class by talking about knowledge, just knowledge, and he went into history and said, these are all of the contributions that Muslims have made to civilization. And he also kind of prefaced that by saying that Prophet Muhammad, was really the instigator of this love of knowledge. And when I say instigator, that's not a bad term. He was really the spark plug that kind of motivated future generations of Muslims and really all people of all walks of life to search for knowledge. So for me, a lot of people ask me, are you gonna convert? Like, how can you say all these things about Muhammad and not convert? It was never this relationship that I have with, Christian Muslim relations and Muhammad and Islamic studies. It was never an issue of conversion for me. It was really about the power of knowledge what can knowledge do for the public good in terms of building bridges between people. And then also it became quite personal. I became a lover of knowledge because I realized that our minds and our hearts and our souls are very fragile, and it's very easy for propaganda and misinformation to warp us. So I became passionate about, defending my mind, defending my principles, being informed, not only through scholarship, but also through human experiences. So real quick before I send it back to you, Daniel, in terms of like my academic background, did my BA at American, and then I actually moved to London and I went to Royal Holloway. And that was the first time I had ever left America. I was 22. It was the best year of my life. Learned more about my country through the prism of other people, which was really shocking to me. I remember one of the first things someone said to me is like, "Do you support George Bush?" I was like, no, I don't. But, it was one of those kind of moments where you're just like, wow, the world really thinks that all Americans are like this. Then I came back to America in 2008 and I joined Professor Ahmed on a 2-year-long project called Journey into America, which was an ethnographic study throughout the country. We went to over 100 mosques, over 75 cities, really met with people of all walks of life to explore what it means to be an American through the lens of Muslims. So this anthropological study was absolutely quintessential to my growth as an academic, but also as a human being, because I was going into people's homes, places of worship, businesses, communities. I mean, really, it was a really eye-opening experience. And then I decided to continue on with my own studies, entered into a sociological program at Trinity College in Dublin, and I focused on the lived experiences of young Pakistani men. And I didn't just look at religion, I looked at various things. And these were individuals who were living in Dublin, Ireland, and Boston, where I'm from. That book, that study was published in a book, my first book, Islam, Race, and Pluralism in the Pakistani Diaspora. And since then, really, I've been focusing on bridging the gap of advocating for not only the dialogue of civilizations, but the synthesis of civilizations. And in the last couple of years, Prophet Muhammad and his relations with Christians has really been the focal point of my studies. So that's a quick backdrop of who I am and what I've been up to the last couple of years.
Great. And before we get into questions about your current work, I wanted maybe Osman or somebody from the Intercultural Association also to make sure that they had a chance to introduce themselves and what this organization is about. So you have a little bit of grounding on that as well before we engage in this conversation. So Osman or anybody at the Intercultural Association could do an introduction real quick.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, Craig. Craig, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being with us. Ali or Yunus might do a better introduction than me, but
But I can see you.
I'll give it a shot.
I can just see you. You're the only one outside of Craig. No one else is showing their camera, right?
So we were engaged with some intercultural and interfaith dialogue activities in the Michigan region for quite a while. I would say about a decade, right? So I'm here for about 3 years. I work at Oakland University here, Craig. But my friends here have been working on intercultural and interfaith dialogue activities, about 10 years. And Daniel was really an integral part of many of those efforts. So we were really sad when he got a different position at another state. So Intercultural Association of Michigan is a new organization. The reason we started this one, earlier we had more central organizations. We were operating under the umbrella of Niagara Foundation, which is based in Chicago, but we wanted to give a better focus on our local presence. So we said we should have something that's based on Michigan, that really focuses on Michigan. And Michigan is such a culturally diverse environment. We have many different ethnic communities, um, even, from different beliefs, Christian communities from Middle East and different parts of the world. So it's a really good soil, good environment to um, really do some sort of intercultural and interfaith activities here in Michigan. So we have been kind of slow due to the COVID pandemic. As usual, we have been doing some online activities, but really trying to be one of the well-known organizations in the state for intercultural and interfaith dialogue efforts. So that's what our focus is.
Great.
Great. Yeah, that's a great introduction. And yeah, I was in Michigan for a couple years, and this group is very active on the interfaith front. And I really felt like your presentation today, Craig, would be such an appropriate, presentation for this group, because I really feel like what you cover in the book, overlaps with a lot of the work that's done, not just by this organization here in Michigan, but all across the country. There seems to be a growing interfaith movement trying to understand each other in our faiths and our practices. And at the end of the day, right, that where we started the discussion about, some of these countries and states going in another direction, right, trying to, eliminate diversity and eliminate, different faith communities from their countries. That it'd be nice to have this effort here to make sure that any effort like that in the United States has this pushback from an interfaith community that says that no, we're stronger because of our diversity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, to understand each other, right? Like what your experience was with, was it Akbar? You said Akbar Ahmed, or
Akbar Ahmed. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, like it was actually, experiencing, or let's say collecting experiences and memories and stories is arguably just as important, if not more important, than the scholarship, and I think obviously the two in tandem is where the pure real knowledge comes about. But like just a quick example, like in giving talks in churches in Texas, I often face backlash from some community members, and I get some statements from people who are literally like, Muslims are evil, or like Islam is a threat. And instead of like unpacking this, getting into theology, I just present them with stories that I've had with Muslims who, have welcomed me into their home, who have done amazing things for me, like just to try to chip away with something like a story that's familiar to people, rather than making it, well, the Quran says this, and then, you lose people when you do that sometimes.
yeah, and that is a good point. It's really great to focus on those commonalities and not get too wrapped up into some of the theological differences, where I'm pretty sure Muslims and Christians are not going to agree on after 2,000 plus years of
Yeah,
debate,
exactly.
right? But that doesn't mean that there's so much division there that there isn't room for, understanding and kind of agreeing to disagree.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
I
yeah,
agree. And I
yeah.
think the thing is, like with Daniel, with like theological debates, I'm not big into debates, and I'm sure you weren't suggesting like we should have debates, Daniel, but like discussions, right? Like theological discussions. I do think that they're actually really important, but I think in terms of, getting to know the other, I think having those theological dialogues or discussions should come a bit later in the process. Like I often have been saying recently, when we engage in interfaith dialogue, let's say, there's an imam and a priest, and they're bringing their communities together, and they want to develop a relationship over 2 years. I would wait like 3 months before we even talk about religion. And I would just focus on, little things like, let's break bread together. Let's, simple things like that. Let's wait until we develop trust and rapport before we dive into the heavy duty stuff, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting about what you were doing with Dr. Ahmed, because I'm pretty sure I ran into you when you were much younger and I was much younger in Omaha, Nebraska.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
I
Yeah.
I was in that focus group when Dr. Ahmed came in there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you
Was that
probably don't remember me at all, but
the thing is, like, I remember being in Omaha. I'll tell you that. Was it Creighton? Was it at Creighton University?
no, I think you guys came out to the mosque, the Islamic Center of Omaha.
Oh, wow.
And Dr.
Man.
Ahmed was there. There was also some graduate assistants. You were probably one of them. I just don't remember.
Yeah, I
Yep.
was. There was a Frankie. Yeah, there was a couple of us. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Wow,
can't
that's
remember.
amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't even
Yeah.
know that. Yeah.
Yep. I've been running around the Muslim community for about 20 years. And I also had a similar experience, although I don't know if I ever met a Dr. Ahmed, but I certainly with my experiences with the Muslim community, ended up becoming Muslim myself, and then going to a Muslim country, and the rest is history. But yeah, but have like a similar background in a sense that grew up in a predominantly Christian Catholic environment, raised Catholic myself,
Oh,
and yeah, up until about my junior or junior high school years, when my mom pulled me out of the church for reasons that I can't really figure out why. She never told me the reason, although I do know that there were some problems in the church that we were going to. And so ended up becoming disillusioned with religion for a long time, I
me
think,
too. Me
until
too.
I came in contact with Islam. So
That's amazing.
yeah, right. So and so I just wanted to segue a little bit into the work that you did for this book, and really your impressions or experiences, and really impressions of the literature, but also I mean, not just the research on Islam and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but on just his interactions, the stories of his interactions with religious minorities, in particular Christians from all different parts of Arabia, and why you felt that that was such a compelling story to tell
Mm.
for I mean, this book that you're working on now, and in the book that you've published.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me quickly say too. I know originally, Daniel, we had the forthcoming book as the main focus, and I'm happy to really focus predominantly on that. The only reason why we didn't go with it on the flyer was because the book is currently being edited, and I didn't want to go public. Even though I have shared the book cover with my social media network, I didn't want my publisher to necessarily think I'm, jumping the gun and spilling the beans on this book, because
Mhm.
to be fair too, it's being peer reviewed and hopefully everything holds up. But in the humanity of Muhammad, I focused not only on Muhammad's relations with Christians, but also kind of people of all walks of life. And maybe, Daniel, do you think I should say a few things about the humanity of Muhammad first, and then we can transition? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. So the humanity of Muhammad has 7 chapters. And I think for the purpose of our discussion, I'll go through the first 3. And I'll begin with the civic nation building. Before we started here, we were talking about this trend around the world in which, groups' sense of belonging in given nations is becoming more exclusive, where nations are becoming more ethnocentric. They're becoming not necessarily less diverse, but less accepting of diversity in terms of national belonging. And I wrote a chapter on Muhammad's approach to civic nation building. And I was inspired to do this for several reasons. One, I'm a firm believer in the civic nation. I believe that a civic nation has principles and components that can lead to socially harmonious societies. And essentially, a civic nation is one in which the national identity is really rooted in laws. And these laws are egalitarian and democratic. So the best of America, the best version of ourselves, which arguably has recently won out with President Biden, is a civic nation. And this is a nation, it's more of a contract. Anyone can belong to it, no matter what you look like, no matter what you believe. You know, what makes you a member of that nation is the laws, the Constitution. And yeah, as an American and as someone who has studied the founding of this country, you know, when you look at the founding fathers, for all their flaws, I do believe in what Denise Spellberg of the University of Texas in Austin wrote with the founding fathers. She said that they imagined Muslims as future citizens of the country. And I think this vision of a pluralistic civic nation is one that is rooted in American history, but it's also rooted in Islamic history. And then here we have a really important example, not only to bridge the divide between civilizations and religious groups, but if we look at current events, the civic nation is under threat. It's been under threat significantly in this country over the last 4 years, but you look around the Muslim world, if you want to call it that, civic nations, you know, like Saudi Arabia would not be a civic nation at all. They really, their laws are not conducive to inclusion. Let's leave it at that. So Muhammad, you know, arguably is one of the first political leaders in history to devise a nation, a confederation, a republic of different groups of people. And he did this in Medina in 622. And if you can imagine, you know, he goes to Yathrib, Medina, and he is supposed to perform in this role as a mediator, as a judge. He brings all of these diverse groups together, and he's thinking to himself, well, what is the glue that's going to make everything stick? How is this going to work out? You can't create a hierarchy based on religion or race or ethnicity, because historically that's what the Medinese people had suffered with, you know, this kind of hierarchy and this tribal structure, and, you know, people blatantly discriminating against others. So Muhammad comes in and he creates the Constitution of Medina. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. A simple Google search can pull it up. But if you actually look at the various elements of the Constitution of Medina, in many ways it is a precursor to later documents in Western history that outlines freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, the right to own property. This idea that a nation or a given community is part of a larger political community, and that all of these different groups within this political community are kind of dependent upon one another. You know, when we look at the United States, in many ways, it is a republic, you know, like you have different states, and then, you know, we work together on some things, and other things we're kind of left to ourselves. The Constitution of Medina is pretty much that. And it's an important reminder, because for people that don't have favorable views of Muslims or Islam, perhaps they could change their mind a little bit by looking at this specific example of the Constitution of Medina. And then for Muslims, you know, how might a Muslim leader, if you can call it a person that, you know, how do they justify the persecution of religious minority communities with the Constitution of Medina in mind? Like, how does that even happen? The other two elements of this book that I want to look at, the second one is religious pluralism. And I'm clear in the book with what I mean with religious pluralism. Religious pluralism, I do not define it as this idea that all gods are the same. I think, unfortunately, that term has this kind of connotation. You know, this idea, I get criticized all the time on social media. People are like, well, you're a religious pluralist, you think all gods are the same. I've never said that. What religious pluralism is, and I borrow this from Professor Diana Eck at Harvard University, quite simply, she refers to religious pluralism really as a process. And it's a process that entails the energetic engagement with religious diversity. And she is saying that pluralism pushes us beyond tolerance. Religious tolerance is a good thing, she says. You know, you can't have pluralism without tolerance. But the issue with tolerance is it allows communities and groups of people to often live in isolation without really getting to know one another. So if you think of it like a simple example, like if this room that I'm in right now, we had 4 communities. Each community is in a corner of the room, and we're going to tolerate each other. You know, we can share the space together, but we're not going to share goods. We're not going to share ideas. We're just going to let people be. And again, this isn't a bad thing, but what Eck is saying is tolerance, this process that I just explained, actually reproduces the divisions and the stereotypes because we don't get to know one another. So Muhammad, I argue, is actually engaging in not merely religious tolerance, but he's engaging in religious pluralism. And the example that I use in the book is the visit of the Christians of Najran to Medina, to Masjid al-Nabawi in around 630. And clearly there was tolerance because, one, the Quran at least tolerates Christianity with terms like al-Kitab, people of the book. But we also know that Muhammad invites them to Medina, right? So even then, we begin the process of getting to know one another. And the historical sources tell us that the Christians and the Muslims inside Masjid al-Nabawi engaged in a critical dialogue with one another on Christology, the nature of Christ. And you can kind of imagine perhaps some moments of tension and some people shaking their head and say, I can't believe you think that. But we know, at least through the sources, that there was no significant friction or tension to the point where it could destroy the friendship. So that's a good thing, you know, and X says this with pluralism. Pluralism doesn't have to be this kumbaya moment where everyone has to agree on everything. That's not what it is. It's not realistic to expect human beings to all agree on everything, especially when it comes to religion. So they agreed to disagree, which is a good thing, but they came to understand one another. And then we also see Prophet Muhammad engaging again beyond this mere tolerance by offering a space in his masjid for Christians to actually pray, which to me is arguably one of the most important actions that he ever made. Because even today, when we think about something like that happening, with a mosque opening up for Christians or vice versa, a church opening up for Muslims, it's just such a contentious issue, you know, even around places of worship, even to this day. You know, extending that kind of welcoming hand, allowing something like that to happen is just so controversial for people. And then the last element that I can talk about is the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. And we know that Muhammad, for the simple fact that he was receiving revelations from God, God is the creator of all human beings, created all of us equally, I believe. So naturally, Muhammad's message would be a non-racist message, which means he did not believe in racial superiority. But we also know that Muhammad went beyond mere non-racism and that he actually engaged in anti-racism, which is similar to the difference between tolerance and pluralism in the sense of Muhammad giving more action, kind of going the extra mile, taking the extra step to really make a difference. And the examples that I use in the book are the relationship that he had with Bilal ibn Rabah. Not only did Muhammad work to free Bilal, who was an Abyssinian someone of Abyssinian and an Arab descent and a slave, not only freed him, but allowed Bilal to climb the, if I could call it this, the social hierarchy of the early Ummah. So Muhammad was not looking at this individual and say, okay, well, we're going to free him. He shouldn't be enslaved. But also, Muhammad could have easily said, well, but we're also not going to rub people the wrong way by allowing Bilal to get into a position of power. Muhammad could have done that, but he didn't. He actually allowed Bilal to become who he was, which was a very prominent early believer in the first muezzin, the caller to prayer. And then, of course, the farewell sermon. The farewell sermon is another excellent example of not only this advocation for racial equality, but if you can think about it, I mean, one of the last things that Muhammad said, is certain groups of people have no superiority over others, except in impiety in good action, which is really interesting. And I'll end here to make a parallel between the farewell sermon and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. So here we are, 1,000 years later. We have an African American, a descendant of slaves, a Christian, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Lincoln freed the slaves, and King says, and I'm paraphrasing, I hope that one day my 4 children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And Prophet Muhammad said something very, very similar. So I suppose the example that Muhammad set, and the example that I'm inspired with, is his kind of pushing us to do more. It's not enough to merely tolerate. We have to really get to know one another. It's not enough to, allow a group of people into your nation. We have to find ways of integrating them into this civic body. And with the distinction between non-racism and anti-racism, this one is really popping up all around the world today. Being non-racist is no longer enough. You need to be anti-racist. So that's the book in a nutshell.
Great. And actually, at this moment, I think it would be great if we were to open up for questions, just because there was a lot of content there and probably a lot of questions that were coming up as you were talking. And so please feel free. We have 27 participants -1, so 26 participants in this Zoom call that can ask questions of Craig. So feel free to unmute your microphone. I don't think there's any limitations on that, or to chat your questions into the chat window, please.
Hello, can I ask a question, please?
Yes, of course.
Hi, Daniel, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Thank you so much. Craig, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate. I really like the correlation or the similarities that you built between the current nowadays and the similarities the Prophet Muhammad's time. And in related to this, I would like to, maybe it's going to be a general question, but I would like to ask this: what are the some similarities between Jesus and Muhammad's life, basically? I know it's a very general question, but
yeah,
I just would like to see your view at least.
So the second to last chapter of the book is called The Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule, as probably everyone knows, is treat others how you wish to be treated. And growing up, it was obvious to me, because I read the scripture, that Jesus walked the walk and talked the talk in terms of the Golden Rule. And then when I came to Muhammad's life, I started seeing a lot of similarities in terms of treating other people how you wish to be treated. And in addition to this kind of overarching concept, I think Jesus and Muhammad are really kindred spirits, and I've referred to them as kindred spirits many times, in the sense of the old Jewish saying, which is tikkun olam. Tikkun olam. I think tikkun olam has roots in the Old Testament, but it's a famous Jewish phrase, Hebrew phrase, which means to heal a fractured world. to heal a fractured world. And I think that Jesus and Muhammad both had a mission, and that mission was to fix what was wrong with what was happening in their given communities. So if you look at this, the environments and the social conditions in which Jesus was born into and Muhammad was born into, pretty similar. You know, with the Meccan situation, you had kind of hyper tribalism. You had petty rivalries, ongoing violence. You also had certain groups of people being dismissed. Women really didn't have a ton of value. And if you look at Jesus's early life, you saw something kind of similar. Not necessarily with hyper tribalism, but perhaps more so with like corruption. You know, you had the Roman Empire was there doing their thing, trying to maximize Jerusalem and the Jewish people as much as they could for their own power. And then you had the Jewish leaders basically being their puppets. And what happened, I think, in both situations was a complete and utter disregard for what we might refer to as the periphery of society. So when you read the Gospels, one thing that Jesus did that was revolutionary was, you know, feeding those who had no food, being with people who were sick and, you know, ill, dealing with non-Jews, the Samaritans, for example. You know, so like Jesus is trying to bring all of the people that have been forgotten back into the fold and to bring them back into society so they can be valued. And I think in many ways, Muhammad did something similar. You know, I didn't even mention earlier Muhammad's love and appreciation for orphans, because he was one essentially, you know, so looking after the periphery of society and their concern for those that have been left behind, I think really sticks out to me.
Thank you.
Great. Additional questions? I haven't seen any come through chat yet, but this is a great opportunity to take what you've just heard, an analysis of the book, and ask some questions. I have a few questions of my own, but I want to hold off on my end to open up to the group because we have 25. So there's Osman raising your hand.
Yep. Craig, thank you so much for the talk. I just ordered the book from Amazon, so I'm looking forward to read it. Thank you. So my question is, I'm sure when you're making this presentation in various environments, you got the question of how do you view the violence in the name of Islam, you know, in the format of Daesh and all others, with the content you're presenting. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I think the humanity of Muhammad doesn't necessarily deal with these moments in early Islamic history that deal with violence. The second book that I'm writing, The People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians, is more a biography, and I actually get into why the violence happened. And it did. I mean, we know historically Muhammad did engage in violence, though it wasn't on this mass scale that people think. These were pretty small battles for the most part. But I think the way I handle it is, number one, usually with Christian environments, I would say sometimes we shouldn't compare Jesus and Muhammad. Like Jesus, we know, was like straight up nonviolence. And I think Muhammad was too, but Muhammad had a different role. You know, he was the head of state. He was the main general. So what is he supposed to do? I think, generally speaking, he was a believer in self-defense. And I think a lot of scholars would agree that when Muhammad did engage in battle, it was largely due to his interest in preserving his community, preserving the people that had sacrificed everything for their well-being and for their salvation. You know, and I often bring up the situation that happened after the kind of fall of Medina with the Constitution of Medina, and what happened with the breakdown of the contract. You know, and a lot of people will just look at the Quran and say, well, this is what happened. The Jews were annihilated. But, you know, it doesn't really provide any real historical context, comments like that. You have to get into what actually happened. So these specific examples that need to be understood, need to be broken down, do not advocate a wide sweep of saying violence is always justified, especially against a group like the Jews. So that's kind of how I would navigate that. In regards to Christians, you know, like I was actually going to post something today. I saw a beautiful story in Mosul, and you had Muslims working to repair churches in Mosul that ISIS had destroyed. And these are young Iraqi Muslims, which is a great sign. And they're working diligently to make this happen. That is in line with, I think, Muhammad's vision, and also some historical documentation, if you consider the covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. So yeah, we have these examples too, in which, you know, Muhammad is not advocating for violence. Most of the time, it's the exact opposite.
And we got a question in chat as well, on a similar topic. So this is good segue. What is your advice to Muslims to change the narrative about radical Islam? Is Islam what Muslims make it, or are Muslims not able to represent it properly?
Well, I'm asked this question a lot. I actually think, and perhaps this is unique to the American context, but I think Muslims do a good job of living their faith, of following their prophet in a similar way to what we've established here. I think the problem is we just don't hear it. We don't hear from Muslims enough in the media or the newspapers or in political circles. So I think the real issue is not that the narratives don't exist. The real issue is that the narratives are not being heard. And I think Muslim communities need to do a better job of organizing and getting that idea out. And it's similar. I tell evangelicals and Catholics the same thing, because evangelicals don't have a good reputation either in the American public. But I know so many really role model evangelical leaders from Texas who are engaged in the same type of work that I am, you know, in terms of Christian Muslim relations, but you just don't hear it. And same with Catholics, you know, like the only time you hear anything about Catholicism in the media is usually around abortion or same-sex marriage. And that's it. I mean, sometimes, well, we do hear from Pope Francis, who I like. So yeah, it's not that the narratives don't exist. It's just that we don't hear about it. And this reminds us of the power of the media. And the best way to change the narrative is to kind of own the narrative, you know, getting into a position of influence and power where you're not depending on other people anymore to produce the narrative. You are actually able to create the narrative. I think that's important. Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that we don't have control over, any community, evangelical, Catholic, Muslim. In the media is going to report always on those things that are going to catch attention. And what catches attention is not these good, wholehearted, you know, stories about people kumbayaing, like you were explaining, right?
Love and peace. Yeah.
Love and peace. They're gonna highlight those things that are controversial, because those are the things that people are gonna read.
Yep.
You know, when it comes to the Catholic religion, it's always about, I mean, I hear about the anti-abortion, same-sex marriage debate, but also, from what I know, at least, you know, around where I'm at, it's about the improprieties of the local priests, and then the Catholic Church trying to get them out of trouble. Yep. You know, sexual abuse of children, right?
Which all need to be recognized too. You know, it's not that we need to replace one narrative with the other. Right. It's just we also need to make sure that we're not always focusing on what is wrong. You know, and I often tell students this, you know, like, especially students, Daniel, I'm sure you would agree with this. Like, or other academics in the audience, we live in an age where young people are genuinely really upset, you know, and they didn't like the previous administration, perhaps for the appropriate reasons. And they want to be so critical, and they want to focus on, you know, what's going wrong. Like, what are the inequalities? What is the racism like? And I tell them, like, listen, you got to address these things, but there's also other narratives that are encouraging and constructive. And they're important to highlight because they remind us of people's agency, of people's ability to create that narrative, to be that narrative. And I think the media needs to do a better job of just balancing things out a little bit and not just focusing on why some communities are problematic, you know?
Yeah, and that's throwing a lot of fuel on the fire.
Yep.
And that's really unfortunate because, and I think it's also led to this backlash against the media too.
Mhm.
You know, everything that they say now is questionable right now. So now that, you know, it's fake news and all of that, and we know where that's taking us. You know,
Yep.
like our Facebook friends are more legitimate than CNN,
Yeah.
no matter how
Sure.
truthful or untruthful it is. But I have another question on chat as well. If Muhammad Islam lived today in the fractured and polarized world that we are in now, what would he do? For example, what kind of practical actions would he take to initiate regarding racism in the United States? That's a good question.
That's a good question. I think number one, he would encourage people to engage in authentic dialogue. You know, I think I could see Muhammad being, you know, obviously he was a highly intelligent person. I don't think he would be like, you know, get off social media and don't use it. I think he would say you can use it, but also make sure that there's balance. Make sure that you're actually having authentic dialogues with human beings in the flesh, in person, visiting other places of worship, you know, welcoming people into your home and really kind of getting to know one another. I think he would be an advocate for change at the micro level. You know, the change kind of starts with us. It starts within us as individuals first, you know. This is like the jihad, really, the struggle of understanding the self. How can we improve the self? And then kind of having a network effect, you know. Once an individual has the kind of light bulb go off, then, you know, start engaging with neighbors, and then kind of work the way out. So I think he would begin at a very, very simple level. And I like to use the term deuce, and you can actually see it. My wife Miriam made it for me. Deuce on the wall here. It's an acronym that I use to kind of operationalize pluralism. And it stands for dialogue, education, understanding, commitment, and engagement. And I think Prophet Muhammad would see value in this in terms of chipping away at some of the social ills and inequalities that we see. You know, we need to start talking with one another. You know, there have been so many studies that have shown that, at least in relation to kind of Christian Muslim relations, there's a correlation between negative sentiment of Muslims among Christians and Christians not knowing Muslims. Think about that. I'm guilty of this, but not in terms of human beings. I'm guilty of this in terms of food. There are some foods that I look at and I just won't eat because I'm like, I can't eat that. But we have human beings doing this with other human beings. The best way to chip away at this is dialogue. Then once you develop trust with other people through the dialogue, then you can get into education. You know, this is when you trust a teacher enough, even though they may not be from your background or your community, you know that what they're offering you is relatively objective and it's part of the solution. Then we get into understanding, commitment, and engagement. And this is when we actually start working together, you know, in person, actively working together to solve social ills. And we have so many examples in Muhammad's life where, you know, he is not telling his community to retreat, you know, don't engage. When is he ever really saying that outside of a context of war? You know, when they moved to Medina, they engage with the Aus, the Khazraj, and all the Jewish tribes. He invites the Christians of Najran to his masjid. And one example that I didn't bring up, and I'll end here and then we can open it up. The first Hijra, which is one of the most remarkable stories of early Islamic history. And if you can imagine, you know, Muhammad being the leader that he was at the time and the prophet, he basically tells some of his closest companions and family members, just leave all of this behind. And I want you to go to the Red Sea. I want you to cross the Red Sea in a boat. And I want you to go to Abyssinia, a land that you've never been to in your life. You have no idea what's going to happen to you there. And I want you to go. And we know what ended up happening. It was a very constructive story. But, you know, Muhammad knew something about this Christian leader. It was about faith. It was about trust. And I think through the Deuce, we can get to a point where we really know one another and we're able to trust one another and work together with one another. I think that's important.
Great. And now I have a question. It's on another track, but I think it's appropriate given that your book is published through Tugra, through Blue Dome,
Yes.
as is my book, right?
Yes. Which I've read. Yes.
Right. I know we were talking about
I've
that.
read it, yeah.
I appreciate that. At least I know one person out there has read it. So that makes me feel a lot better about that. Actually, you know, that book, I wrote that for my parents.
Did you?
Yeah, my parents were both Christian. You know, my mother probably more or closer to Christianity, at least, you know, understanding and trying to practice it to a certain extent
That's beautiful.
than my father is. And I think that tends to be the case. And so I wrote that because I don't think they've ever gotten over the me converting to Islam. You know, we have less discussions about that now. You know, like it comes up from time to time, but I think there's this generally held idea about Islam that for them, it's just, I'm part of something that they can't accept. And that it's something that is not a good thing to be a part of, you know, but I think their views on Islam have moderated. But I wrote that book to show them that, you know, this guy, Jesus, peace be upon him, and this guy, Muhammad, peace be upon him, really, they weren't that different after all. And I understand that, you know, Jesus never commanded any armies. He certainly didn't run a city state. Muhammad Sallallahu did in Medina for 10 years. And that's why you have a lot of verses in the Quran that you could find corollaries to in the Old Testament, right? In how, you know, for instance, in the Psalms, right? In Prophet David and Solomon, right? In running the country of you know, Bani Israel, the tribe of Israel, right? And they're in Palestine. And so I made this case that Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in Mecca, what he was communicating in Mecca was very similar. I mean, obviously not spot on because they're in two different contexts, but very similar to each other. I wrote that book for them to understand that this is not that alien.
Yeah.
But I'm not part of some really different thing.
Can I ask a question, Daniel? Like, what part of because I would love to learn more about this, and maybe I just didn't overtly pick it up in the book, in your book, but is there a certain part of Psalms that deals with this time in history that you've made this parallel with Medina?
Oh no, and I know that's the thing. I got a lot of requests. I gave a presentation down in Atlanta on this book with a Hizmet related group, and that's kind of the question that was asked, but I'll circle back to this question that you just asked me. Whether or not I would write another follow-up book on the relationship between Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam in Medina and the rules that he was, you know, through the Quran and through his life and practice are similar to the rules in, you know, the Old Testament and, you know, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then of course the Psalms and the rules that were there as well, but in particular with the Old Testament, not so much Psalms, but the Old Testament in the like Deuteronomy and Leviticus and that. And so really drawing those connections to really the tribes of Israel in the books that were handed down to them there. And I haven't gotten to that point yet. And to be honest with you, I'm at this point in my life where I'm really driving towards tenure. And I'm not in a religious studies department. I wrote this book for my parents as my hobby in studying interfaith dialogue and religion.
That's good to know, though, Daniel, because I'll tell you, like one question that I often get on social media, and it's typically from young people, and it's from young people who are in interfaith relationships. So either the man is a Muslim or a Christian, and the woman is either a Muslim or Christian, and they have issues with their family members. And like, it's literally getting to a point for some individuals where their love cannot continue because they are fearful of losing parents. So it sounds like, now that I know why you wrote that book, I feel like it's a good book to actually recommend to other people, to say, well, here's a piece of knowledge. This may be beneficial to you.
Yeah, that these personalities, that Muhammad Sallallahu and Jesus, peace upon him, were not that different. They were both experiencing persecution in Mecca, and if Muhammad hadn't migrated to Medina, he might have faced a similar fate. Who knows? Of the prophets of old, right? Prophets in Bani Israel, the prophets, the Jesus, peace upon him, in Palestine. And so, we wouldn't have had that second chapter of his life, those 10 years in Medina where he was running the city-state. Because you've indicated maybe in maybe social media posts, and because I follow you on LinkedIn, and that there, might be some pushback on some of the ideas, because you've been published in Newsweek, so, these prominent national and international publications. So it's not just journal articles and books, which don't get as much prominence, but these media outlets. So I'm almost assuming that you've gotten some pushback from groups that are very, are against this idea that Islam is a legitimate religion, even, and that Muhammad Sallallahu is a good man, or was a good man. Have you gotten anything like emails, hate mail?
Oh yeah. My parents have gotten hate mail. It started when I was writing for the Huffington Post. I think my first publication with them was in like 2012 or 2013. And I wrote an article, and actually there's a section of the book that focuses on this. I look at Prophet Muhammad's kind of ethical daily principles on how to live your life, and comparing that with George Washington's book called Rules of Civility. And all I did in the comparison was just look at like how Muhammad and Washington approached like cleanliness, or like dealing with a person in the physical, like what do they do? So that article was picked up by Fox News, and then it was picked up by Islamophobia Inc., or the Islamophobia industry. So if you're familiar with Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, Frank Gaffney, Daniel Pipes, I got on their radar. And you can Google News my name and like Middle East Forum, which is Daniel Pipes' website, and they're like 2 or 3 articles per month, maybe that's a bit high. And then same with Jihad Watch, Robert Spencer's website. So these people are constantly just bashing me for whatever reason. So I've become pretty numb to that, and I expect that. But I'll be honest, in recent years, there is increasing backlash, I think, and I need to be careful with this because I don't want to burn bridges, but backlash from Muslims who think that I am trying to bring, as a Christian, I'm trying to bring Muslims away from a more traditional understanding of Islam. And they see me, and I'm not even kidding, as like a deep state operative, that I have a hidden agenda. And the other argument that people are making is that I'm trying to create a new religion, which is a synthesis of Christianity and Islam. And they link it to what's happening in the Middle East with this new alliance between Israel, UAE, the Abraham Accords. And these people are literally saying, like, I'm part of this crowd, and my goal are these things, which I think all of us in here are pretty confident that these are not. This isn't even within the realm of reality. You know, like it's not happening. So I also got a lot of backlash for my stance on the Hagia Sophia, and I came out publicly and said, I'm not happy with the move. I think it should have remained what it was. If it's going to be turned into a place of worship, it should be a shared place of worship. This triggered a massive backlash as well. I don't know how much of it was like bots and Erdogan's, cyber bullies, but there was a lot of cyberbullying from Pakistan as well. And there's a weird kind of fusion now with Turkey and Pakistan, at least in the social media realm. So I think a lot of people, when they see my work, like they think that I only write for like Christians, you know, like I'm speaking to my own people, but I really don't write or speak or act for any group in particular. I just share it with for all people. And people don't realize that there are a lot of Muslims who do not like what I write about and what I stand for. And that's a real challenge, you know, especially among US Muslim youth. Like if you go to YouTube, there have been these young Muslims who have followings who, I think one video on YouTube is like Craig Considine, the Christian with Muslim followers. That's the only title, you know, so like kind of playing this identity politics. And this person just starts talking about how I'm misguided, how I'm trying to bring Muslims away from the straight path, and how instead of retweeting me, they should be praying for me in the hope that I get hadiah and I convert. So these are the dynamics that I work with. Yeah, it's interesting to say the least.
Yeah, excuse me. I'm
ahead,
so
Sally.
sorry that I should. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should say that this is exactly the same thing what Hizmet movement is facing, especially for the past 5 years.
Mm.
And you're not alone, Craig.
And you know what? I was going to mention this earlier. I think another community that faces these type of dynamics happens to be a community that identifies itself as Muslim, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, which there is so much misunderstanding among Muslims of what the Ahmadiyya community is. And they're getting backlash not only from non-Muslims because they identify themselves as Muslims, but also from within the Muslim community. So, you know, when we talk about these type of relations, I feel like it's easy to overlook the, this idea that even someone like me can also get backlash from Muslims in my work. And honestly, that's where most of the backlash is coming these days, which it wasn't always that way, but now it is for whatever reason.
Daniel, if you don't mind, I was going to ask another question related to this actually.
Yeah, please.
To Craig. So, have you had any chance to present your book or books to the any Christian environment like churches or any Jewish communities? And I'm really wondering what their reaction to the topics that, especially about Muhammad. I mean, I believe it's really hard for you to put the context for those who doesn't know about Prophet Muhammad at all. I really wonder if you have done something like that.
I have. I'll say that most of the events and audiences that I do and see happen to be Muslim, but I have given plenty of talks over the years, especially even in light of the humanity of Muhammad, to Christian audiences. But I think typically most of these Christian audiences have already made up their mind in terms of the importance of interfaith dialogue. So they actually come into the session hoping to learn a little bit more about Muhammad's life and legacy and his relations with Christians. The real challenge is to kind of get into communities that don't think learning about Muhammad is even important. You know, like getting into the communities where there's apathy, where they don't see the value in this type of book. That's the real challenge, you know, and like, I wish I had the power and the resources and the money to, you know, do this on my own, where I could reach out and travel the country to actually present this book to Christians. But there's only so, I really don't have a lot of capacity. Like, I'm a one person show, if I could say that, you know. In terms of Jewish communities, you know, unfortunately, I really have not had a very kind of systematic relationship with specific communities over the years. And I'm not sure what this is about. I hope it's not about my position on Israel Palestine, because I have spoken out publicly in defense of, or let me say, against the settlements. The settlements really, really bother me. I think they're absolutely atrocious. But I don't know if that's impacting the lack of engagement that I've had with Jewish communities. But, you know, these are the dynamics that people like me and Daniel, I'm sure you have experienced something similar. You know, you kind of, I just interact with those that reach out for the most part, and I'm happy to do so. I wish more Christians and Catholics would reach out, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had similar experiences, and I mean, I haven't done a ton of outreach, you know, to the evangelical community or the Jewish community. And I don't know if that's the case with the pro-Israel stance with the younger Jews. I was on a call, an interfaith call, talking about the issues of Islamophobia. And there was a rabbi on there, and she was saying that the younger Jews are not as, you know, focused on the Israel-Palestine issue. They're more focused on domestic issues. They're more focused on hate groups targeting their community. And those same hate groups are the same ones that are attacking the Muslim community. So they see a natural alliance there. But I think what happens with the younger community, the Jewish community, and possibly even the Muslim community, is that there's a less of an interest in having this discussion through religion.
Yeah.
You know, and so when we're talking about Muhammad and Jesus and Moses and that, like, they're just like, oh man, we don't want to talk about that. As you know, that's not relevant for our discussions today. So having that faith-based perspective coming into those, what we might say is interfaith, but maybe intercultural discussions for the younger Muslims and Jews, is just not as relevant, and they wouldn't consider it as something important to include in those discussions. So then the faith stuff gets cut out.
Mhm.
So I haven't had any access there with that. But I've always said, and I've had many meetings with Muslim community organizations saying we need to have more interfaith dialogue with the evangelical community,
Yeah.
because I see evangelical Christian community and the Muslim community having a very natural, I think they could sit together and understand each other very well,
Absolutely.
you know, but they're butting heads clearly. And I remember, you know, many evangelical churches hosting very Islamophobic speakers, and then Muslims have gone to those events to push back. I mean, you go to these mega churches, you know, and Muslims will go to these events to question what they're arguing there, what the speaker is arguing, and being chased out, you know, being like, boo, get out of here, you know, and
Yeah.
that's really sad, you know, and I hope that going forward, especially considering the fact that evangelical Christians make up a sizable portion of the Christian community in the United States and are the dominant Christian community in many states, especially in the South, that there's more inroads there. And I'm not the expert to ask, how do we make those inroads?
There are. I'll give you some examples. So there's a good friend of mine named Pastor Bob Roberts. and he's based in Dallas. And Imam Pastor Roberts has become good friends with Imam Magid in Washington, D.C. And the two of them have really been traveling the world together, meeting various Christian leaders, Muslim leaders, trying to create programs that can bring Christians and Muslims together. And they've done an extraordinary job. And one of them is a Imam Pastor retreat. And, you know, let's say a dozen imams, a dozen pastors will spend a week together in the middle of nowhere in like a campground. And they go through classes, but really what ends up happening is the imam and the pastor become like a connection, like a friendship. And then this begins the process of introducing communities to one another. So there are inroads, you know, like it's happening. And Pastor Bob Roberts has a bunch of young people who are, you know, a little bit older than I am, but who are also evangelical pastors who are really concerned about Islamophobia in their community, which is a great, obviously it's not great, but it's a good sign that they're cognizant of it and they're working to alleviate the bigotry.
Yeah. And hopefully Pastor Bob Roberts writes a manual for us all.
Yeah, I hope so. He's a good man.
How to create inroads of your evangelical neighbor.
Yep.
Yeah, so I know that we were going to end this at 1, and we only have a few minutes left.
One thing, maybe we can have another session when the next book comes out. It's supposed to come out in May, but this one is called People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. And like I said, it's being edited at the moment. So like even when I was preparing this morning for this talk, you know, I was like, man, like I kind of forgot what I wrote as well, you know, because it's still being edited and there are some things that I'm sure will be hacked away. But essentially this book is a biography of Prophet Muhammad's life, told uniquely in a way through his interactions with Christians. And that's the main focus of the book. Obviously, I need to fill in the moments where Christians were not necessarily directly involved, but the book also digs into who these Christians were or who they could have potentially been. So when we talk about Waraka ibn Nafal, right? So when everyone knows Waraka, or you should, in 610, when Muhammad returns from Mount Hira, goes and visits Khadija. Khadija brings Muhammad to Waraka to kind of legit or to evaluate what just happened to Muhammad. And Waraka was at least a Hanif, but a Christian. I think most people would agree. But what type of Christian? How did that type of Christianity get to the Arabian Peninsula? So actually, I spend a good chunk of the book providing a Christian historical context. You know, who were these early Christian groups interacting with Muhammad? Like, who were the Christians of Najran? We know they were Christian, but were they Nestorian? Were they Ebionite? Were they Miaphysites? We had all of these different kind of Christian groups, which I've tried to unpack. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, if it passes the peer review, it'll be published in North America by Oxford, but if not, it'll be published by Hearst Publishers in London. So
nice.
Really excited about that book. And then I have another before we go, if you don't mind. I just submitted a proposal to Polity Press, which is also based in London. And this one is called The Synthesis of Civilizations, Building Bridges Between Christians and Muslims. So my theory here, I use the clash of civilizations, the dialogue of civilizations, which is something Hosh Effendi and Pope Francis have both advocated for. But my third concept actually pushes it a little further and talks about the synthesis, because just because there's dialogue does not always mean that something comes out of that dialogue. So I'm actually looking at the moments in history in which Christians and Muslims didn't merely tolerate and coexist. They actually worked together and flourished and created something new. So I use the sociological concept of hybridity when I talk about synthesis. So the book has about 12 chapters, and I use countries as case studies. So I look at what's happening in Muslim majority countries with their Christian populations, and I look at what is happening with the Muslim minority populations in Western countries. And I say, this is what's going wrong. Let's go back into history to figure out how we got here, but let's also use history as inspiration to fix some of the things that are happening today. So if that book hopefully is published, it'll be like 2022.
And we had, I know we're well past the 1 o'clock mark, but Ramzi, he had a question and I wanted to get him in here. Ramzi?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Craig. I wonder if you have in your new book the Christian of Najran, when they visited the Prophet and in his masjid, in his mosque, and then the time for the Christian for prayer came, and he allowed them to pray in his mosque. So this is a kind of how he respected the Christian. Do you have that in your book?
Yes, I do. And it's really the main focus of the chapter on religious pluralism. And it's a pretty short chapter because it's a pretty short book, but yes, I deal with that exclusively. In the next book, the one that's called People of the Book, I spend even more time like really unpacking what transpired and also like who the Christians of Najran were. You know, like this was a community that had been living in the Southern Arabian Peninsula for a couple hundred years, you know, and like they're linked to the Byzantine Empire. Like, who were these Christians? You know, like were these Christians more aligned with a traditional Islamic view of Jesus? Who were they exactly? So the book tries to shed light on that. And I'll say this, Ramzi, too, like I think I mentioned this in The Humanity of Muhammad. If not, it's in the next book. But I think this is a really important gesture for all religious communities to make, actually opening up places of worship to the other. And it really, I think the reason why I'm advocating for it is because when I do suggest it, people become really, really defensive. And for me, I'm trying to kind of break down some of these walls, but it happened in 2015, I believe, in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral. And this was, I think, right before or right at the time of the Muslim ban being announced. And we had the female leader of the Washington National Cathedral open up the church doors, beautiful building, and allowed Muslims to pray as an act of goodwill and solidarity. I think
Yes.
little things like this are really important.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramzi.
All right, great. So if we don't have any more questions from the group, and by the way, I just noticed that the settings on this Zoom had all the chat just going to me. So
Oh,
no one
really?
could see but me, these chat, like, so so whoever set this Zoom up, come on, guys. And I mean, it does help with like, you know, these, if you get somebody in there making really rude comments, it's isolated to the host only, but yeah, so this is really great, Craig. And I hope that we can actually do a follow-up.
Yeah,
in
let's
some of
do
these
it.
books. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your prayers. And we're praying for all of you as well. Hopefully with everything happening in our country, this is the beginning of a brighter, more open and more peaceful period, which I've been praying for quite some time. So praying for all of you. Thank you all so much for your feedback and for your presence here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
All right. So
Alrighty.
yeah, we can, our reactions, right? Our little hand clapping.
See y'all. It was
Okay.
a pleasure.
See you,
Many
Craig.
thanks, Craig. Wish
Thank
you the
you.
best.
See
Take
you
care.
guys.
Wish you the best.